Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you for that very, very generous introduction. You set a high bar. I guess I'm going to say something sensible now. And thank you for this opportunity to be the first Volkswagen visiting professor. It's been such an amazing experience so far. All these frighteningly smart students that are here, the postdocs, the scholars, the fellows. I've enjoyed these wonderfully enlightening conversations. I've learned so much about the environmental humanities through all these new lenses, new inflections and ways of thinking about things. So thank you so much. But also, I've been very lucky to give talks all around the world in different universities, scientific establishments, institutions, all kinds of places. But I have to say this, the Rachel Carson Centre is exceptional, and I mean that absolutely. So thank you, Christoph. Do you all agree? It's absolutely exceptional. Exceptional, and as you said, the best lecture series, I second that, and thank you all also for coming along for your interest today. You know, when I used to give mushroom talks 30 years ago, there'd be 3 people in the audience. One was your mum, one was your aunt, and one was a dog, and that was pretty much it. So I get excited that we are in something of a bit of a fungal awakening, a mushroom moment, and there's a bit of a turn, so thank you all so much for coming along. That's enough thank yous, let's get on with the show. So, the dark web. You might be wondering, why did I call it the dark web? What's that about? And why is there a mushroom there with a bit of a web connected to it? I mean, perhaps when you think of the dark web, maybe you think of the perhaps somewhat sinister underbelly of the internet. The bit that search engines can't reach, that isn't visible. And the place where criminals perhaps lurk. But fungi aren't criminals. At least not the ones that I've met, or they're often cast as such. But there are similarities between the dark web and the dark fungal underground and mycelial web in the subterranean beneath our feet. And that first similarity is that the dark web is anonymous, or at least the people who interact there are often doing so anonymously. And fungi are anonymous as well, not to each other, they know who each other is, but they're largely anonymous to us. We've named something like 1 or 2% of the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of species out there. We know so little about them. We haven't even named them, described them, worked out what they do. The mycologists, that is the scientists who study fungi, they're starting to get an impression of what fungi do, but they're mostly still talking in terms of generalisations. We don't know the individual players or species and how and when and what they do and how they interact and how collectively they help to hang the planet together. We're still trying to work that out. The other thing about the dark web and the dark fungal web beneath the soil, the dark web is unencrypted, that is, it's insecure. Fungi are cryptic, that is, they're obscure and they're mysterious, but they're also insecure, that is, their livelihoods are. And that is because we continue to disrupt and destroy their habitats by blasting them out of the subterranean through mining, by stealing their food through agriculture and forestry, by sealing them permanently beneath the surface through concreting and roading or upending their lives in some other way. I've been looking at fungi for a few decades now. As Christoph mentioned, I started out in the watery realms of freshwater science, and then gradually I climbed out of the quagmire and onto the land to have a look at what the fungi were doing, because not so many people were trying to figure out who they are and what they're doing. But don't get me wrong, it's not that fungi or mushrooms are some kind of favourite organism, so to speak. You know how some people are really into orchids, or they're really into cacti, or perhaps they're into butterflies or dragonflies, or maybe polar bears or kittens. You know, there's these favourite groups of organisms. I'm not trying to sell you mushrooms. It's not that there's some favourite group of organisms, although some of my best friends are indeed polar bears and kittens. But what's interesting about fungi, for me, is that it's what they do, and in particular, that they wobble the assumptions of how we understand the living world, how we understand life. For example, when I studied science and the humanities at university, there were these wonderful frameworks that we have to understand how the planet functions. We had Darwin's ideas, and we had people like the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus, who gave us a system for naming and organising and categorising organisms. And these models and frameworks and metaphors and theories. They're wonderful to help us make meaning of this thing called life. But most of those were put together based just on two kingdoms of life, on animals and plants. And what the fungi do, they come in and they mess the whole thing up. They wobble these assumptions. And sometimes I think about the lasting legacy my mother left me. And it was to have a healthy disrespect for authority. And I love that about her. I sometimes wonder if she's fungus, because that's what fungi do. They mess up the way we think about things. And you might be thinking, well, what is she talking about? How are they messing things up? Let's take a notion, a really simple one, like the idea of the dichotomy of the sexes, of male and female. I mean, most of us worked this out pretty young. I remember being a young child and looking at the other children in the neighbourhood, and there was basically little boys and little girls. And I remember being quite annoyed at that point in my life that I was in the little girl camp. That was quite irritating. So I learned to kick a football better than all the boys. And I succeeded to work that one out. Then I could move on to other things. Football was done. I moved on to more interesting things like fungi. That was really great. So we had this dichotomy. And when I studied zoology, botany, there was male and female. So the fungi, we actually call them mating types rather than sexes in the fungi. Some have 2. There's some that have 3. Some have 4. But there's one that has 22,000. I mean, more recently we've become much more fluid in our notions of sex and gender, and that it's not so, there's not a dichotomy. We've now got all these other categories. Thankfully, we've come up with these wonderful acronyms like LGBTI, and I'm not sure how far through the alphabet we are now. But fungi worked this out back in Devonian. I mean, they've been doing this for 500 million years. They've worked out that we've got more than just the dichotomy of sexes. So why is this interesting? Well, think about if we're trying to survey a forest for the species that are there. It's handy to know which one's a male, which one's a female, but suddenly you go out to fill out the form and something's got 22,000 sexes. That kind of starts messing with your ideas of what sex is. Or take another example of the idea of individuality or plurality, or the idea of a bounded organism. I can look at Christoph and I can see he's got 2 legs, they're very long legs, and 2 arms, and he's got a torso and he's got a head. That's always handy to have a head. And I can go, okay, he's probably a primate. The fact that he's wearing clothes is a really good hint that he's probably Homo sapiens. But what's great, I can see he's a complete bounded organism. I can count him. There's one of him. Oh, there's a whole lot more. I can count them all. And that's really handy, not just if you're an economist, but if you're an ecologist as well. We like to enumerate things. We like to be able to count things and graph them and map them and make algorithms. And having a bounded organism makes it much simpler and go 1, 2, 3, I can count you and graph you and categorise you and divide you up. Where does a fungus end and begin? It's not a bounded organism. And I know that you're not just human DNA, you're actually a collective of multiple species of fungi and bacteria and all sorts of things, that we're all collectives of symbiosis. But if we look at a fungus mycelium, where does it begin and where does it end? If we dig in the soil a bit and we see this feathery, cobwebby network. Have you all seen that? If you roll over a log and you see this cobweb-like network. But it's very hard to work out. It's not a contained, bounded organism, so it makes it very, very hard to count or to enumerate. If I come out in the morning and, the front lawn, there's a beautiful fairy ring of mushrooms. I'm going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 12 mushrooms. But how many fungi have I got? I ask you. 12 mushrooms. Oh, another one's popped up. I've now got 13 mushrooms. But how many fungi is that?
Countless.
It could be 1. It might just be 1 producing 13 mushrooms. But in that patch of soil, there might actually be 456 fungi, but only 1 could be bothered producing mushrooms. But we don't know, unless we were forced to test that soil and test the DNA, and all becomes very abstract trying to work that out. So they're very, very hard to count. If we're trying to put something on you know the notion of red lists, these lists that measure the extinction risk of different species. I'm worried about a fungus species and think, I haven't seen one for a long time. It only grows on very, very old logs and we're losing those or whatever. I've got to be able to count it to get it on that red list, but they're very, very hard to enumerate. Or take another example, when I say they wobble the assumptions, we're used to thinking of organisms as having a lifespan. They're born, they live for a period of time, and then they die. And it's handy to have an idea of the lifespan of an organism. Say, for example, you want to buy a pet. It's sort of a good idea if you've got a a sense of how long. I was going to get a tarantula once, and then I realised they live for 20 years. Can you imagine that responsibility of having this thing every morning that looks at you with 8 eyes and says, well, what are you doing today? You know, like, it's a good idea to have an idea of its lifespan. We know that if you're a woman in Germany, you can expect to live for an average of 83.3 years. If you're a woman in Australia, you get a bonus 2 years. 85.3 is the average lifespan for a woman in Australia. If you're this tiny insect called a mayfly, you usually only get to live for 1 day. That is in your aerial phase. They have other phases underwater. Or if you're Germany's national tree, one of them, if you're an oak tree, Quercus robur, you can expect to live maybe to 1,000 years. More commonly, they live to 500 or 600 years, but they can live that long. It's a defined lifespan. So most species have a defined lifespan. How long does a fungus mycelium live? How long does shiitake live for? Or how long does an oyster fungus live for? Be brave. Have a guess. You're all very shy. How long does an average fungus live for?
10 years.
10 years?
100.
100?
1,000.
1,000! Can we go higher than that? Forever. Forever. Technically, there's no lifespan. I mean, when I grew up, this was the stuff of sci-fi. Do you remember The Hunger with Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon and David Bowie, this idea of eternal life? This was sci-fi, this was fantasy. Things lived and died. There was a lifespan. There was no such thing as eternal life. A fungus, technically, under the soil, imagine this mycelium, it's under the soil, it's looking for food, anything with carbon, so plant, organic matter, sticks and leaves and things in the soil. If there's always food, they can technically live forever. But what happens when someone comes along and builds a road and the mycelium is going, oh, comes to the road and goes, yuck, bitumen, can't eat that. And it sends a message to the rest of the mycelium and says, oh, any food back there? And the rest of the mycelium sends a message back and says, no, you ate it already. So you go, oh, no more food, we've eaten all the food. What does the fungus do? It goes, panic, I better make some mushrooms. Up comes the mushroom, release the spores so they can keep their genes going. But the mycelium, the organism dies. Remember, the mushroom is just the organ of the organism, so to speak. Like the flower in plants or the gonads in animals, it's just the reproductive structure. You're eating sex organs on your pizza. Okay, so what I'm saying is when we do things like that, like put a road, there's no more food. What is it? Mycelium doesn't eat bitumen, so it dies. So there's probably very few examples where a fungus can actually live on forever, although we have found fungi in the US that have been dated to 6,000 or 7,000 years. And I'm not very good with numbers, but many thousands of hectares big. And you'd think they'd be in Texas, given everything's big in Texas, but they're actually in Oregon, these ones. So this is what I mean by fungi sort of undo everything I've ever learned, and that's what I like about it. I get this sort of foundation of knowledge from childhood, university, my working life, and then fungi come along and they go like this, they pull out something, the whole thing goes, oh, that's how I understood life, and suddenly I've got to sort of reconfigure how I think about it. But what fungi are doing, we often talk about plants, producers, animals, consumers. They're the third part of that. They're the great recyclers, and they're breaking down that organic matter. They're putting architecture in soils. They're holding soil particles apart. They're aerating soils. They're making them inhabitable. They're filtering water as it gently trickles down through to those deeper horizons. But what they're also doing is linking up the ecosystem. And by now, you might be getting a little bit trying to imagine, this is really hard to visualise. It's really hard to imagine this linking up network of fungus mycelium. So I'm going to take you with me down beneath the soil. Imagine now we're all moving down underneath the soil. It's getting darker. Maybe there's some writhing, wiggling things. Don't worry about them. They'll disappear soon. And I want to demonstrate this relationship that most fungi, or so I should say most plants, over 90% of plants, form with fungi. So every single needle tree, every single conifer, every single northern hemisphere broadleaf tree, every single orchid, most shrubs, most grasses, many crop plants, all form these relationships with fungi, but they're hard to imagine. So what I've got is this very high-tech metaphor that involves a poster tube. Now imagine we're all down under the soil, we're in the subterranean, and this poster tube represents a rootlet of a tree. A rootlet is a very fine root on the end of a larger root. It's under the soil, it's feeling around, trying to find nutrients and water. This is probably magnified about 500 or 600 times of a real root. And basically, a root is a conduit. It's a pipe for conducting water, conducting nutrients. It also gives the tree or the plant something to anchor, but it's basically feeling around, looking for nutrients, looking for water. But you know what? Most plants aren't very good at it. They're not very good at getting a great suite of different nutrients and as much water as they need. And also, even the finest rootlet, it's quite a big, clumsy, clunky thing. It can't actually get in between those tiny interstitial spaces, the gaps and pores in between the tiny particles of sand and dirt. What the fungus needs is its mycelial partner, the fungal partner, to help it access those nutrients and water. And I represent those, so the cardboard pipe is at the root of the tree, we're all into the soil, and the mycelium is represented by my elderly neighbour, time to hear this, private pantyhose collection. So, really good. Julia, to stretch out the mycelium for me, Chris. Thank you very much. I like to be a good one as well. So, imagine now, we're all under the soil. Here's the tree root, okay? And the fungus forms a sheath or a mantle around the cortical cells, the base of the root, and expands out the root system of the plant, sometimes by over 1,000 times. So the plant's now got much greater absorbable surface area that it can absorb nutrients and water through, okay? And also the mycelium is much, much finer. It's about a 40th of the width of a human hair compared to a plant root, so it's got far more reach. It can access those tiny gaps and spaces that the root can't reach. Fungi have a great suite of enzymes or chemicals that can break down organic matter that the root can't do. If this root comes across a bit of wood, it can't break that wood down and unlock the nutrients. The fungus has the chemicals that can do that. It can break down those recalcitrant compounds like lignin and cellulose that give wood its hardness. So the fungus shoots the nutrients and water back to the tree, and in return, the tree gives the fungus a lovely feed of sugars that it produces through photosynthesis. So it's a two-way, mutually beneficial, what we call an ectomycorrhizal symbiosis. So ecto just means external, the fungus attaches externally. Myco is the prefix for fungal, rhizal is root, and symbiosis is an alliance or a relationship. And so pretty much every tree, when you walk in the English garden, you look out the window there, every one of these is connected to fungi. And it's not just one fungus. We know that an oak, for example, or a spruce, two of the very common trees around here, they'll have up to hundreds, possibly even thousands of different fungal partners. Some are good at getting phosphates, some can get nitrates, some can get unusual things like selenium or manganese or boron or other things. Some fungi play a defence role. There are fungi that can loop their mycelium into what's called, like a lasso, into a constriction ring. And then it secretes a tiny bit of something delicious into the soil. Well, it's delicious if you're a nematode worm. These are these invisible worms, and the worm comes along and goes, ooh, like that, and it swims through the loop, which constricts by hydrostatic pressure, strangles the worm, and then the fungus absorbs its nutrients. Pretty macabre. Even that's your oyster mushrooms. Who eats oyster mushrooms? You might not anymore, because I do that. So there's this amazing relationship, and this tree doesn't just have its harem of different fungi, but say this tree is doing well, it's photosynthesizing beautifully, but Susanna tree is down in the gully a bit, she's a bit shaded, and she's on a bit of a rocky reef, she can't get enough nutrients. This tree can send that one some carbon via the wood wide web. Okay, that's the name of the metaphor for this underground network. Now, we all know metaphors are very problematic. By their nature, metaphors grossly simplify things, and sometimes metaphors get a bit carried away before the science can catch up. And we saw that happen with the publication of the forester Peter Borlöv's book, The Secret Life, The Hidden Life, one or the other, of trees, where there was a big protest about that book. There's 4,500 scientists who signed it because they were saying that it was a bit too cherry-picked and the ideas a little bit too far-fetched, and some of the science and the fantasy got blurred at times. And so you've always got to be cautious of metaphors. His work was based on the work of a British Colombian forest scientist called Suzanne Simard, who looked at these relationships, and Simard showed that one tree, what we call a hub tree or a mother tree, on average, is connected to 43 other trees. And I think this is a phenomenal finding. I mean, you know, I grew up as a kid in these groups called field naturalists clubs, and we'd go out on these excursions and we'd make a survey of all the butterflies, and then in autumn we'd go out and we'd make a survey of all the fungi, we'd write lists of things. We'd go to the coast and look at all the intertidal organisms, and I came back with all these inventories and lists, and they were helpful. But no one ever said, this particular truffle fungus can only survive because it's connected to that tree, and it can only survive because a particular animal comes along, digs it up, eats it, bounces off and distributes the spores. It's a three-kingdom connection. We never talked about those. It was always the biological autonomy of species, all these lone statues that we called a taxa or a species, or as we call them today, an OTU, an operational taxonomic unit. So species concepts are very blurred. But, you know, I did this little demonstration once with a group of scientists from the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and one of them said to me, this really changes the way I think about the forest. You know, I'm walking down the forest thinking, this tree could be connected to that one, and there's a whole lot more going on beneath the soil than I realised. And she said, my sister lives over the border in France, in Besançon, and she runs a creche, and I think you need to come to the creche and take the kids out in the forest and explain ectomycorrhizal symbiosis and ectomycorrhizal symbiosis and how this works. And I said, a creche, like little people? She said, yeah. I said, like how? She's like 3 or 4. I said, these are quite big concepts. They're quite abstract. Don't you think we should wait 10 years and then I'll come? And she said, these are French children. I went, okay. So I thought, oh no, I'm not very experienced with communicating these things to little people. And I thought, how am I going to do this? She said, just bring your pipe and your pantyhose, you'll be right. So I started by getting some really psychedelic ones, you know, hot pink and electric blue, and ones with sparkles embedded in them. And so we get out to the forest and there's all these little people tearing around madly, and we start stretching out the mycelial web, and each child grabs an end, and so each child, of course, is representing a tree connected to this fungal web. This is where I made fatal flaw number 1. I had 18 ends to my pantyhose and 19 children. So there's this little girl, and she's running around, she's trying to grab an end, and each time she misses out and she's standing there, and all the kids have got an end and they're pulling on it, and she's standing there without an end. So her response to this was to have an absolute catastrophic meltdown and spin round on her back like a dying fly and scream French expletives at me. And I thought, great, what do I do? So I thought, right, took off my hard hat and I put it on her head, and I said, you don't need to cry, because you've got the most important job of all. You're the forester, and you have to decide which of these trees you're going to cut down. That was fatal flaw number 2, because it took her about a millisecond, and she eyes off this little guy, flies horizontally through the air, grabs him by the throat, he goes flying and lands in the mud. And because he went down, and all the kids are pulling, kids being kids, there's so much tension on the network, when he went flying, they all went flying, the whole network collapsed. And look, I'm not saying when you cut down one tree in the forest that all the trees fall down. We know that doesn't happen. All the trees got back up and started punching each other, so we know that doesn't happen. But simply, as I said, I grew up listing things, naming things, this autonomy of species. These kids aren't thinking like that. They're thinking about networks, interrelationships, interconnections, processes, and maybe one day even responsibility of their role within that. And to me, that's a very different way of conceiving the forest, the wetland, the garden, whatever ecosystem you're in. If you're aware that what I do here could have implications somewhere else, even if I can't protect them because I'm not below the soil. Or, you know, it's not just cutting down a tree. If we dam this creek and put in a reservoir here to make a nice pond because we want to get some ducks, but what happens to those plants further down that need to have wet feet? So I think these children are thinking in an entirely different way to how I did about nature. Thank you very much, mycelium holders. I really appreciate it. Because that little metaphor help. Remember, as I say, metaphors simplify. It's not that simple. We're really still trying to work out how significant these networks are, which species are the main players, so there's still a huge amount to learn. Well, I should just show you a few pretty pictures of the things we're talking about. We know we have a phenomenal diversity of fungi, depending on what you read, 5-6 million species, but most of those are the microfungi, the ones we can't see without a microscope. Things like moulds and yeasts, these are the microfungi, but the ones we're more familiar with, probably the most familiar is the cat and stalk style mushroom that we see pop up above the earth. That's the most familiar. But you can see they manifest in all these other forms. I'm sure you've all seen puffballs and maybe coral fungi or jellies or all these other forms as well. They grow in all kinds of environments. So whether we're talking about the wonderful Laurisilva forests of the Portuguese Madeira, which are an absolute hotspot for fungi, or whether we're talking about the amazing Cascade Mountains in the Pacific Northwest and all the amazing trees that grow there, or the turning mixed deciduous and conifer forests of Europe, or the eucalypt-dominant forests of Australia, all of them harbour a tremendous diversity of fungi. And forests are what we typically associate as fungus environments. But fungi grow in deserts too. This is the central deserts of Australia, and you wouldn't think there's fungi there. And maybe they're not the ones that are like this, but they're the truffle fungi. I'm sure many of you might have eaten truffles at some point, perhaps the famous Perigord truffle, the diamond of the kitchen. A truffle fungus is basically a thoroughly modern fungus in an evolutionary sense, and it was once a mushroom that came up, an umbrella-style mushroom like this, that over evolutionary time realised that if you live in a hot, dry continent like Australia, it's not a great idea to be an umbrella-shaped mushroom. So the mushroom comes up and goes, oh no, it's 44 degrees, there's a hot, dry wind, and you don't last long. So what they've done, they've got rid of the stipe or the stem and the cap, and they've stayed in the consistent temperature and moisture of the subterrane, where you don't have all this wind and unpredictability. But now they've got a problem, because an umbrella-shaped mushroom relies on wind to get its spores out. There's no wind underground. So how do they get their spores out? Smell. Who smells them?
Animals.
Exactly. So we now have a great suite of different mammals that evolved alongside the truffle fungi that basically come along and dig them up. We know things like who's had Perigord truffles out of interest? Anyone? Yeah? You're not looking to convince Katie? It's a very interesting aroma or odour. It's very hard to smell. We don't have a very good, what I call olfactory vocabulary, a language around, we don't have many words around smell, and we usually rely on similes and metaphors and things to describe them. We'll say it smells like university socks, or it smells like, one person said it smelled like her teenage son's bedroom, which I thought was interesting. Often I ask this question, what is the smell of a Perigord truffle? Can anyone make a suggestion what that is? Anyway, it's a really hard one. Sometimes people say it's funky or it's musky, or and I always ask people, what's your smell? And one person said they smell just like my Labrador dog when he's been swimming in the river and I've locked him in the back of the car. And I think this is pretty weird for something we pay. I saw at the market on the weekend, €6,000 a kilo. Like, that's pretty interesting for a smell of a wet Labrador. And I asked someone else and they said they smell just like rotting strawberries. And I thought, that's such a specific, I thought, what does that smell like? But it's very particular. And someone else said like overripe olives. And I thought, I've got no idea what an overripe olive smells like, but I thought the particularity was interesting. And then someone said to me, no, they smell just like train stations. Train stations? What does a train station smell like? Do they mean that kind of hot chemical smell of the compressor, or do they mean the urine soaked into the train station? And then this one guy, he's just listening to everyone, and he said, no, they smell like a cross between sex and death. I went, whoa, that's a very evocative. And I thought, that's really interesting, because he's alluding towards that putrefaction, that rotting smell, but also the hormonal smell, because what they're trying to do is mimic an animal. I mean, when that pig comes along and digs up that truffle, she's got no concept of 6,000 euros a kilo. She's just going, I know he's down there. You know, that's what she's smelling, the truffle, the hormones of the male pig. So I don't know how we went off on that tangent. That's really weird. I was talking about desert fungi. Most of the fungi in the desert are truffles, and we know that in Australia, in the central deserts, it was Aboriginal women who would go along with a stick. They'd poke that stick into the soil, and then they'd smell the end of the stick, and that's how they'd find the truffles. And I also think they probably looked for the scratchings of all the different types of mammals that would dig them up. Anyway, moving on. So deserts, but also other very extreme environments. This is the Lech Glacier in Switzerland, supposedly the longest glacier in the world. Although it's hard to make claims like that now because it's shrinking by the minute. But as that ice pulls back and recedes, and this bare rock is exposed and this real estate becomes available, the first organisms to colonise it are usually the fungi. That is the lichens, what we often call extremophiles, or lovers of the extremes, because they can tolerate the extreme solar radiation, the extreme cold, and the very inhospitable conditions you'll find up at these kinds of altitudes. So fungi are very important early colonisers of these sorts of environments. But we also find them as the first colonisers after different types of ecosystems are damaged. You can see here a very high intensity fire has gone through here. It's completely, all the green is gone. The canopy's gone, everything's gone. And often they're the very first organisms to colonise that soil and seal that soil surface again, put that stability back in again. So when a bird flies over and excretes a seed, the seed lands among this little sealing of the soil. There's a bit of nutrient supply, there's a bit of structure, and it's got more opportunity to germinate and succeed. But we also find them in ruderal environments, that is, environments that are disturbed by humans, so in our urban environments. And you can see here, it just looks like paving stones, but you've got an incredible collection of different mosses. They're the dark green bits in the bit in the middle, and the white bits are various types of lichen colonising the rocks. So it might just look like a street, but this is also an amazing community of bryophytes, or things like mosses, liverworts, but also the lichens, the fungi as well. And they eat other weird things as well. Fungi like eating speedboats occasionally. You can see here it's growing on the plastic, it's growing on the metal, it's growing on the glass. They can colonise pretty much any substrate that we can create. And this is one growing in my bicycle shed. So fungi can live among us quite well. This is one called Dryad saddle, releasing its spores onto my bike tyre, which probably could be another substrate. So we've been looking at, as I said, the sex organs, the reproductive structures, or sometimes they're called fruit bodies, but I like to return the language away from botany back to mycology. They're not actually fruit, they're sporing bodies, but this is the meshwork of mycelium that I'm referring to. This is the actual fungus organism itself. In this instance, you can see it's set up camp in a piece of bark, secreting its enzymes. I mean, they're getting their food very similarly to us. They're basically secreting enzymes, breaking down organic matter and absorbing it. We do that internally. We put the food into our bodies, we secrete enzymes, digest it, absorb what we want. But fungi don't have stomachs, so they have to put themselves into their food and slobber. So we call this external digestion. We do internal and they do external digestion. You're most familiar, I'm sure, with the umbrella-shaped mushroom, with the lamellae on the underside or the gills on the underside. They come in all these different forms, and like flowers, we see flowers manifest. Some are large, some are small, all these different configurations, and they're all basically a way of trying to get their genes out into the world for the next generation. All these different configurations come around for that reason. This one here is known as the ghost fungus, or Omphalodus nidiformis. I took this picture only by the light produced by the fungus. It's a 4-minute exposure. It's bioluminescing. It contains a compound called illudin that allows it to bioluminesce. And it so happens to look very much like an oyster mushroom. Very, very similar. And every year, this is an Australian species, in Australia people consume this and they put it in their mouths, and guess what? It contains a very powerful emetic, which means it's going to come back out again, but much more violently than what went in. And then you start to glow kryptonite green. No, you don't. Just kidding. But then there's all these other manifestations that perhaps you don't even recognise as a sporing body of a fungus. So the umbrella shape's familiar. How do you evolve to look like something like that? I mean, what are the sort of evolutionary stresses that you end up looking like that? So this is called a cage fungus, or we've got things like this. This is called a candle snuff fungus. You can see it's mycelium in the wood. Again, it's breaking down, it's recycling that wood, unlocking nutrients, making them available to plants. Or things like this one here, the chicken of the woods, a popular edible species, but also aesthetically amazingly beautiful things. Or this little frozen waterfall here, the Hericium. Or your earth stars. So these are all just, again, the reproductive structures of different fungi, all trying to work out the best way to get their spores out, and we're ending with a lichen. So I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, but thank you so much for your attention, for your interest, for coming along. It's been nice.